Welcome to Hagman. This is the Hagman Report, special report for today, Sunday, December 29th, 2019, the final days of 2019 entering into 2020. This very special report with respect to Virginia, what's taking place in Virginia, and really all across the country. For those who watch the Hagman Report, you may or may not know, I announced it last week that the Hagman Report will be off until January 6th. We'll be rebroadcasting from our studios on January 6th, 2020. Until then, I've given the staff, Eric the Tech and others, some time off. Well-deserved time off, I might add, to spend with their families and get recharged. So I'll be doing these reports from my office between now and the time we come back full bore on that. Some amazing things going to be happening in 2020 as well. And I'll be talking about that in future broadcasts. But I wanted to touch base with everyone right now. We have a really serious problem as we enter into 2020, that being, of course, Virginia, what's taking place in the Commonwealth of Virginia with respect to gun confiscation. People might look at that and say, well, wait a minute, no one's confiscating, no one's taking your guns. Well, yes, they are. Or at least that's what the totality of legislation, proposed legislation, in advance of the swearing in of the Democratic leadership of Virginia, that's what they intend to do. There are three specific pieces of legislation, just to be clear. There is, of course, Senate Bill 16, introduced by Dick Saslaw. What Senate Bill 16 does is essentially makes all semi-automatics, whether they're pistols or long guns, illegal, period. Virtually anything but a revolver, illegal. That's Senate Bill 16, introduced by Dick Saslaw. Senate Bill 64, introduced by Senator Louise Lucas. Now, that deals with intent, and I'm not going to get too far into all of these bills, but the intent side of the Senate Bill 16 would be Senate Bill 64. I'll just leave it at that. And you can research these bills yourself online through the Virginia legislative portal. There's also House Bill 67. Now, House Bill 67 is kind of a cleanup bill. I look at it that way, as a cleanup bill. Because of the blowback by the police, by the sheriff's departments and such, what Lee Carter has introduced by way of House Bill 67, he threatens jobs, health care, pensions. They're all at risk. Should you be a sheriff or should you be somebody in county, municipal, police department leadership and refuse to enforce the state laws, then you can be fired, of course, lose your job, and subsequently lose your health care and pensions. That's what this Senate Bill 60 or House Bill 67 deals with. Now, on HagmanReport.com, and by the way, we've got two websites, HagmanReportLive.com. Hopefully where you're watching this broadcast from, that's HagmanReportLive.com. We have that, and also HagmanReport.com. But the issues are the legislation that is consequential to the Democratic change, or the change of leadership into the Democratic governorship and legislature of Virginia. As a consequence of that, they have ushered in and actually had prepared these Bloomberg written, sponsored, and formulated gun legislation plans, or gun plans, and ultimately for confiscation. That's what the deal is here. Now, some reports will say, well, the governor's backing off on certain things. For example, you might recall hearing that the governor threatened to use National Guard, the Virginia National Guard, to enforce the laws, enforce the sheriffs, enforce the municipal police officers. And he kind of backed off that, according to some media reports. I wouldn't be too sure about that, because right now, by way of his attorney general, there are some issues here. In fact, the organization I would urge you to follow with respect to this particular issue Virginia-centric issue, is Virginia Citizens Defense League. That's Virginia Citizens Defense League. I'll put a link to it in the program description box at HagmannReportLive.com. But you see the correspondence from Virginia Attorney General Herring about the pushback, saying, "Hey, look, this is not going to be legally fly. This pushback is not going to. There will be no recognition of sanctuary counties and cities, and they're going full bore now." This based on the response by Herring himself. By the way, you'll notice that Ralph Northam, the governor of California, known as Blackface, depicted, the reason for that depiction or that description is he is depicted in a photo of two individuals, one wearing a KKK outfit and another in a blackface. He's one of them, allegedly. He denies now being both because, well, you really can't recognize who's who, and there's some issues there. But he's denied being both. He admitted being one and then denied, and then it's... But Herring himself has that same issue. Herring himself, actually, Mark Herring himself had a scandal about wearing a blackface. So the reason I bring this up, it's interesting to see the hypocrisy of these so-called leaders. And I would even hesitate to call them leaders. I call them public servants. They serve us, regardless of capacity. They serve us. They're public servants, not public leaders. All right. So we have three pieces of legislation. And by the way, for those people who said, well, you know what, the 2018 midterms, there were some losses and such. Look, this is the consequence of voting. This is the consequence of elections, what we're dealing with right now. And I will say this as well. I don't see an easy way out of this if the course continues the way it is, which it appears to be. Folks, I see some pretty bad things happening here in the future, whether it be by way of a false flag kind of event. And when I say false flag, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means that it's set up by the opposition, or whether it is a Battle of Athens kind of a situation. I see some bad things in the future if the left leadership or left servitude continues to hold this path. The reason this is so important, by the way, just so people, and I know you know this, listeners to the Hagmann Report, viewers of the Hagmann Report, I know you know this, but just for those who don't, the history of gun registration, gun confiscation, they're tied at the hip, of course. It's not just the fact that they're coming after the guns. They're coming after us because of our beliefs, because of our ideology, because of the fact that we are conservatives, generally Christian conservatives, that we believe the Constitution is the ultimate authority in the land. We value human life in terms of, we are anti-killing babies and children, unborn children, of course, whereas the opposition is pro-infanticide. But look back in history for a moment, because what's happened throughout the world can, in fact, happen here in the United States. Very briefly, 1929, the Soviet Union established gun control. So from 29 until 1953, roundabout there, about 20 million dissenters unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. 1911, Turkey, for example, they established gun control in 1911. So from a 2-year period from 1915 to 1917, 1.5 million Armenians, again unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. Germany established gun control in 1938. We know how that ended. 13 million Jews and Christians and others unable to defend themselves were executed, exterminated between 1939 and 1945. China, back in 1935, established gun control. 13 years later, from 1948 to 1952, 20 million political dissidents unable to defend themselves, again exterminated. Guatemala, 64 to 81, 100,000 Mayans Uganda established gun control in 1970. From 71 to 79, some 300,000 Christians were slaughtered. Cambodia in 1956, gun control. 75 to 77, what happened in Cambodia? Millions. Well, 1 million educated people and others were exterminated. In total, some 56 million, on the conservative side, people during the 20th century were rounded up and executed, unable to defend themselves. Look at what's going on in Venezuela right now. And I just want to give this important history because I think this is critical for people on the fence who are thinking, well, we really need to establish these reasonable gun control laws. Any infringement upon the Second Amendment, which it was established to fight government tyranny, which was established to give the citizens a fair advantage of overtaking a tyrannical government. That's why it was established, not for hunting or any other purpose. But look what's happened in Venezuela. Since April of 2017, roughly 163 pro-democracy protesters, they've been murdered by the Maduro dictatorship. Now, Venezuela should serve as an example of how gun prohibition can encourage, actually, gun crime. When you look back in 2012, the communist-dominated Venezuelan National Assembly, they enacted a piece of legislation titled Control of Arms, Munitions, and Disarmament Law. Now, the bill's objective was to disarm all citizens, which they did, and the penalty for illegal selling or carrying a firearm is a prison sentence of up to 20 years. Despite criticism from the Democratic opposition there, the bill went into effect in 2013. Look where Venezuela is now. In 2015, Venezuela their homicide rate was the world's highest. 27,875 Venezuelans were murdered that year. When you look at the broader picture here, we look at the various countries in Central America, other locations as well. You can see anywhere where gun control is enacted, and I won't get too specific here, there is a steady rise of homicides as well as government encroachment on civil liberties. That's exactly what's happened. When you compare currently the U.S. homicide rate, we'll say in 2015, that was 4.9. When you look at the U.S. gun homicide rate, look at the gun homicide rate against the U.S. homicide rate in 2015 was 4.9%. Homicide by gun was only 3.03%. Compare that, of course, to the global average of 6.2%. So I guess what I'm saying is this. Gun control does not work, and it only serves the interests of those tyrannical dictatorships across the world. That's something that we need to really be concerned about. But I want people to really realize this is not a left-right necessarily only debate. Yes, it is clearly a left versus right debate or left versus right decision ideology. Yes, but it's not only that. It is a good versus evil, or evil versus good, evil attacking good. Look at this in a larger sense, because this is about the global global objective here. This is not one thing more that this is not about community safety. It was never intended for public safety. The numbers defy anything that would say that this will make your community safer. It's not intended. This is the most widest, far-reaching, tyrannical move by the globalists in recent memory. That's going to lead, I would suspect, to bloodshed. I don't see any way out of this. And again, whether it's by false flag or whether it's by some other means. Now, to activate the Virginia National Guard, to enforce the state laws. The standing there, according to the Attorney General, they've got the standing. They can do that. Well, President Trump, of course, can come in and federalize the National Guard and then essentially pivot them around 180 degrees and say, okay, you're going to enforce the Second Amendment, or you're going to enforce the federal laws. There is a lot of issues here, a lot of comparisons being made, by the way, as an aside here, between the sanctuary cities in different states. Well, we can establish, if they can establish sanctuary cities, we can establish Second Amendment friendly counties and cities and what have you. Now, that argument is legally tenuous only because you're dealing on a federal level, you're dealing with a federal state issue. And on the other side, on the Second Amendment side, you're dealing with a state local issue. So there are some differences there I would caution people about. But regardless of that, the fact that this legislation, specific legislation, the three pieces of legislation I mentioned, as well as anything ancillary to that, is contrary to the U.S. Constitution and therefore nullified. It's no law at all. And I would urge everyone to research the Supreme Court ruling of Madison versus Marbury of 1803. So in other words, anything that is anti-First or anti-Second Amendment to the Constitution, or any legislation that is antithetical to the Constitution, is declared null and void by the decision, 1803 Supreme Court decision of Madison versus Marbury. And then you look at other decisions, for example, the Heller decision, where Antonin Scalia wrote the majority opinion on, and the McDonald decision, both recent Supreme Court decisions, how they factor into all of this. But again, how this all came about was the 2018 midterms. The Democratic left, the leftists, the communists, really took control of the House of Delegates and the Senate in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And this is what happened. They came in already armed with a blueprint for gun confiscation and for extermination, in my view, extermination of the people on the right. And they were ready to implement this. Now, the pushback, I should say, has been fantastic. And I think this is where we, the people, can prevail. Since the elections and since bringing forth the legislation to confiscate weapons and to leave people defenseless, in a mere 43 days, 90% of the state's counties had become gun sanctuary counties. Now, that number has risen since those first 43 days to 115 areas and counties. And when you look at the map, you can see that in no way does this legislation represent the majority of the will of the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, the bottom line on this, and I'll just leave it at this, I would expect, and I hope and pray that I'm wrong, but I would expect to see some level of doubling down by Governor Northam. I don't believe he's going to walk away from this defeated. You may see some issues where he'll say, well, we can grandfather certain things in, but we're going to make illegal, any more guns coming in of this type and of this form. That's not going to work. That's not going to fly in this case. I think that we've passed that Rubicon. The other part of this as well, you've got the eyes of 12, a dozen, 13, 15 states on Virginia right now. My state of Pennsylvania, neighboring states of Ohio and New York, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Jersey, Illinois, Oregon, Washington, California, and many others are looking at what's happening in Virginia. There are no limits. I guess in my closing thoughts, there are no limits to what I see happening in Virginia if the course continues to be followed in the manner in which it's being followed. There are no limits as to what can happen. Follow the Virginia Citizens Defense League. Please do that. I would urge everyone to go to Virginia Citizens Defense League. Again, the link will be in the program description box. There's a Twitter account. There's a website. Be part of this movement. We have to show up in huge numbers in support of our Second Amendment rights in Virginia. We are all members of the pro-Second Amendment Virginia population as we speak right now, as we sit right now. And if we're not part of this fight, folks, then we're not part of any fight. So with that, folks, I want to thank you. I hope I've earned your support, your subscription to our YouTube channel, your bookmarking of HagmannReportLive.com. I want to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to me. May God bless. Have a great rest of your Sunday.